Christ is risen.
In truth he is risen.
On this particular Sunday of Pascha, we celebrate that incident where Christ healed this paralytic who was 38 years lying in wait for an angel to miraculously stir up the water in this pool, and whoever was the first to go in was cured. Essentially, he had no chance whatsoever in his condition to be the first. Zero. Statistically, zero. Christ came to him and, of course, healed him and told him to take up his bed and to go on walking, which he did. The consequences of that was hatred and envy, not from the man who was cured, but from the Jewish leaders of that time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priests, and all those. The Holy Fathers of the Church make quite a few commentary about this situation with the envy of the Jews and with this whole concept of the Old Testament Sabbath and the rules and laws that they were being obeyed, ignoring the New Covenant rules and laws that Christ came to give. Here, for example, is what the Blessed Theophylact interprets. Quote, this is the very meaning of hatred. They do not even ask who healed him, but who commanded him to carry his bread. They do not ask about the thing that arouses wonder, but the thing that they found lacking. In other words, they want people to observe this Sabbath law of not carrying the bed, not doing any so-called work. The healed one could not give them an exact answer, for he did not know who Jesus was. Jesus accosted him with the remarkable words, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you." We have had parishioners that have, for some sort of reason or other, found residence in the city, in suburbs which are known to be heavily populated by the Jews. And they relate to us some of the incidents that they had to suffer through. There is a particular suburb here in Melbourne which is almost a reflection of Odessa in the Ukraine area. Even the streets have names like Balaclava and whatever. Anyway, this particular person said that one Saturday when he was going out, he stopped at the lights to cross the street, and a woman, young woman, no disabilities, said to him to press the button. She'd been there for a while. And why? Because of Sabbath and I can't do the work. I can't press that button. Another incident he related was when somebody parked close to his driveway so he couldn't get out. And again, on the Saturday, he accosted the person and saying, "Could you move your car?" He said, "No, I'm not going to move my car. Today's the Sabbath. We don't do those sorts of things." You can see the ridiculous extent to which those sort of things are taken. Badly interpreted for a start, wrongly interpreted. There are thousands of so-called Christians, particularly in Protestant sects, which have sort of gone back to Old Testament times and pay homage to the Sabbath as if it is the most important day of the week. They even curse people like Orthodox Christians, whom they believed have turned the Sabbath into Sunday. They've transferred Sabbath to Sunday. Sabbath, Slavonic, subota, is Saturday. It's never been known as Sunday at all. It is a day of rest and reflection. It is the day when Christ rested in his tomb, and when God rested after his creative work, as we read in Genesis. When Christ came and did his work and resurrected, the day of resurrection overshadowed the Sabbath by an infinite amount. And the Sunday that we celebrate as the day of resurrection is also called the first day of the week, or the mystical day, the infinite day, the day when there will be only one day, and that'll be the Sunday in the new heaven and earth that the Lord establishes. The Orthodox Church, of course, from early days, has assigned every day of the week to a particular commemoration. Sunday being the day of resurrection, and there's nothing higher than that. Monday, the angels are commemorated. So if you go to church on a Monday, you will hear that theme, the theme of the bodiless ones, the angelic host. On Tuesday, we celebrate and commemorate St. John the Baptist, the one of whom it says, never was there anyone greater born of women. On Wednesday, we are presented with the cross, the betrayal of the Lord on that particular day. And on Thursday, the great Saint Nicholas is commemorated. How great is that saint? And we all know about him. And on Friday, we start to commemorate the cross again and start to reflect on the Saturday, which is also the day of commemorating those who have reposed. So every one of those days has a theme, and if you go to church on any one of those days for the services, that is the theme that you're going to get. Going back to this situation with what we have read about this paralytic, there are other many aspects that the Holy Fathers have quoted on about that thing. Let's see what St. John Chrysostom, and you can't argue with St. John Chrysostom, what he says about that situation. Seest thou that the soul is more especially disposed towards those things for which she have laboured, and therefore God hath joined labours to virtue, wishing to make us attached to her. In this case we admire virtue, even although we act not rightly ourselves, while we condemn vice, even though it is very pleasant. And if thou sayest, why do we not admire those who are good by nature more than those so by choice? This is really an important statement from John Chrysostom. And it flies in the face of, let's face it, Roman Catholics. Let me read that again. Why do we not admire those who are good by nature more than those so by choice? In other words, if you are born with certain gifts, certain talents, and you haven't achieved them by any sort of work and struggle, we don't admire that. In the case of Roman Catholics in the 1800s, they assigned to the great Mother of God, the Theotokos, this idea of Immaculate Conception, that before she was even born in the womb, she was somehow zapped to be a new creature who could not sin, who could not transgress, who could not use the free will to determine vice from virtue and to choose virtue over vice. And they even went so far as to say that she was born without the fallen nature. And as you know, the fallen nature is that corruption that we all inherit from Adam, from our parents who inherited from their parents, etc., all the way back to Adam, which results in us suffering the tyranny of the passions and finally death. That's how we determine that the fallen nature exists in a person. they eventually die, no matter how good their life might seem to be. And we have to also be very careful about this situation of good life, because once again, those outside the Orthodox Church, outside the original church, consider that overall they already are good. They don't need anything fixed. And if they transgress or sin, they'll run to a confessor if they believe in that sort of thing, confess it, and they come out pure again. This is not the way the church has taught it. Whilst a person carries that fallen nature, there is no way known that they can be pure. Even the holy saints, no matter what height they reached in their Christ likeness, in their miraculous way of life, understood that they carried that fallen nature, and that before the purity of God, they were miles away, and that they could do nothing to overcome that. The Mother of God, however, did overcome the fallen nature, but she still died. In other words, she still died carrying the fallen nature. Christ too was born with the fallen nature. He had to be, because he was born as fully man. And if he was fully man, he had to inherit from her what she inherited from her parents, that fallen nature. That doesn't mean that they're a sinner, right? They call this, initial sin or something, ancestral sin. Nobody is born with sin. You can't, because you haven't evoked your free will. So you can't be born with sin, but you can be born with a fallen nature, which, if you don't look after that, can inspire you to sin when you get older. And it does. It does inspire you if you're not struggling. That's why this thing that St. John Chrysostom says, that it is more worthy when someone has laboured and achieved something than it's not. And in Roman Catholicism, it's the opposite. They honour the Mother of God because she was born, they say, without the fallen nature. What? Which is not true for a start. Why would you honour something that is given for free? There was no labour involved in getting it. There was no show of loyalty to God. There was no struggle against the passions or anything like that. It just happened to be that God had some sort of wind one day that, oh, I'm going to make this new creature, which is not going to have the fallen nature. It's not going to have a free will to choose virtue over vice. And it seems like I made a mistake making Adam, so I'll create this new creature which doesn't have all those passionate, tyrannical things that Adam had. And she can be programmed, I say, excuse the expression, like a zombie. You know, you program this creature, their DNA is different, they are not able to transgress even if they want to, but they can't want to because they don't have that free will to do that. And they honour this. Why would you honour something like that? There is no virtue in that. There is no struggle in that. There is nothing. And yet the original church puts the Mother of God in the true position that she was the first and the last person to keep all the commandments that were placed in front of her. She never transgressed. Never. Despite being tempted and all those sorts of things, she never transgressed. And on account of that, when she died, showing that she had the fallen nature, the Lord resurrected her before the resurrection of the dead in general and took her into the heavenly realm, because there was nothing upon her soul that was detrimental. That's the honour we give her, not because she was born in this sort of straitjacket of virtue for no reason at all. This is a very important concept, because from that flows this idea that I am pure unless I sin and then I go confess and I come back and I'm pure again. You know, when I leave the confessional, I come back pure. Well, if that's the case, why do you sin again? You know, why? Because of the fallen nature, right? So you're not pure. You have that fallen nature which is an infinite distance away from the way Adam was created initially and the way of Christ's likeness. That will all be undone at the resurrection of the dead and the new heaven and the earth, where we will be given that ethereal body that indeed will not have the fallen nature, but will be judged to be either in eternal punishment or eternal bliss. Which leads to, again, the notion of what we read today, that Christ said to this paralytic after he found him, "You have been well, go and sin no more," implying that his condition was due to sin. And indeed, that is the case quite often, that people attain different sicknesses on account of their unrighteous life. In fact, there are two ways of looking at that. That's one way. But then we have a whole league of holy saints, miracle workers, great people who are always sick. Some could even not get out of bed, and we can see them even today in various places in monasteries. They can't even get out of bed. They're lame, they're blind, they have defects of various times, and yet they work miracles. What's the situation there? Again, the fallen nature is there, and through God's wisdom, it is to modify their greatness so that the vice of pride and vanity doesn't overtake them. Because whenever you do anything that looks virtuous, that idea of that pride and vanity rushes in like a roaring lion and sort of undermines your whole work. It's very hard to be in a state where you have that pure freedom from pride and vanity. Very hard. And therefore the Lord allows them to have different ailments for which they are thankful. And that thankfulness is also a great virtue, because it is a definite witness that they belong to Christ, that they are keeping his commandments. Because his commandments is you're going to be sick. Okay, thank you. If that's what the Lord wants, I'll be sick and I'll bear with that, and that will be my path to salvation. And often that's what we find. What about those that don't fall into those sicknesses, that seem to live this life of great luxury and, don't ever have any of these problems? St. John Chrysostom again writes, "Let us, if you will, shut a man up, only feeding and pampering him, not allowing him to walk, nor conducting him forth to work, but let him enjoy table and bed and be in luxury continuously. What could be more wretched than such a life?" And indeed, what could be more wretched than that sort of life? Because a person then goes through without the least realization of their true spiritual state. And therefore, at the great judgment, they have done nothing to fix up the defects of their soul, and therefore their judgment upon them is very harsh and eternal. These are just some of the aspects that we can glean from this particular feast day today, the healing of the paralytic. During this period of the Paschal period, we have also to witness the healing of the blind man and a few other things before the ascension of the Lord and before Pentecost Sunday, when the Holy Spirit will be given for the beginning of the church. Bear these things in mind, and don't let the enticements of the world, and particularly these enticements that you think you've done good, pull you away from the knowledge that inside of us, in our souls, we bear the fallen nature, and whilst we bear that, we bear the state of Adam after the fall, and we are not worthy of the heavenly realm. God willing, in our life we will be found to be sufficient somehow through our repentant life to be allowed into that heavenly realm. And there will always be degrees in that. God help us and protect us in all things, and may we really see this Paschal period with great joy and with attaining virtue in our lives. Amen. Christ is risen.
Truth is risen.